My first all-terrain vehicle was a one-wheel drive. Could take you anywhere you had nerve enough to pedal it. Most of the other kids around had decent, well-mannered bicycles of distinct makes and models. Mine was a balloon-tired monster born out of wedlock halfway between the junkyard and second-hand store. Some local fiend had built it with his own 3 hands and sold it to my mom for about the price of a decent milk cow. Two-wheeled ATV by Patrick McManus. For 2 cents, even a used jawbreaker, I would have beaten it to death with a baseball bat. But I needed it for transportation. And transportation, then as now, was the name of the game. You could walk to some pretty decent fishing holes, all right, but when all the guys you were with rode bikes, you would have had to walk pretty fast. Perhaps the worst thing about the bike, as I called it within hearing range of my mother, was that you simply could not ride it in a manner that allowed you to retain any sense of dignity, let alone elegance. The chief reason for this was that the seat was permanently adjusted for someone about 6'4", and I'm a person about 5'4". The proportions of the handlebars suggested strongly that they had been stolen from a tricycle belonging to a 4-year-old midget. The result of this unhappy combination meant that whenever I rode the bike, my rear was about 3 inches higher than my shoulder blades. The bike had a couple of little tricks it did with its chain that the Marquis de Sade would have envied. One was that it would wait until you had just started down a long, steep, curving hill. Then it would reach up with its chain and wind your pant leg into the sprocket. This move was doubly ingenious, since the chain not only prevented you from putting on the coaster brakes, it also shackled you to a hurtling death machine. Many was the time that a streamlined kid on a bike streaked silently past cars, trucks, and motorcycles on grades where a loose roller skate could break the sound barrier. The bike's other favorite trick was to throw the chain off when you needed it most. This normally happened when you were trying to outrun some of the timber wolves the neighbors kept as watchdogs. You'd be standing up pedaling for all you were worth, leaving a trail of sweat and burned rubber 2 inches wide on the road behind you. Then the chain would jump its sprocket and drop you with a crunch to the crossbar. The bike would sometimes go for weeks without the front wheel bouncing off. This was to lure you into a false sense of security. You'd be rattling hellbent for home, and for a split second you might see the front wheel pulling away from you. Then the fork would hit the road and whip you over the handlebars. I spent half my waking moments repairing the bike, and the other half repairing myself. Until I was old enough to drive, I went around looking like a commercial for Band-Aids and Neosporin, even on one of its good days. Its good days. The bike looked like an accident in which 3 people had been killed. Much as I hated the bike, I do have to admit it was one of the truly great all-terrain vehicles. It could navigate streams, cross fallen logs, in general do pretty much anything except climb trees. Several times it did try to climb trees, but the damage to both of us was sufficient to make continued efforts seem impractical. Our bicycles in those days were the chief mode of transportation for about 90% of our camping trips. Loading a bicycle for a camping trip was not simply a remarkable feat of engineering, it was a blatant defiance of the laws of physics. The standard packing procedure was to dump most of your stuff into the center of a tarp, roll the tarp up into a bundle with half a mile of rope, then find 9 boys and a man to lift it to the rear fender of the bike. Anything left over was tied up in the hammock and attached to the diminutive handlebars. Then, you sprang onto the saddle and pedaled with all the fury you could generate from 98 pounds of bone and muscle. The bike would howl and rage, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the entire catastrophe would move out of the yard and wobble off down the road on some incredible journey. But such a legendary mode of transportation deserved equally legendary final moments as a recognizable entity. There was a hill about 3 miles from my home called Sand Creek Hill. By rights, it should have been called Dead Man's Drop or Say Goodbye Hill. Just as I crested the hill, whom should I notice coming up it but one of our neighbor's timber wolves. From 50 yards away, I could see his face brighten when he caught sight of me hurtling towards him like doom on two wheels. He crouched expectantly, his eyes happily agleam. The chain, not to be outdone, chose that moment to eat my pant leg halfway up to the knee. I expected to be abandoned by the front wheel any second, and the great straining mass of the rear pack threatened to collapse on me. With one last great effort, I aimed a quick kick at the wolf, ripped my pant leg free, and threw myself into space. I bounced 4 times to distribute the injuries evenly about my body, and finally, using my nose for a brake, slid to a stop. The bike apparently self-destructed shortly after my departure. Probably the front wheel came off and the 2 packs took it from there, ripping and mashing and grinding until there was nothing left but a streak of assorted rubble stretching off down a hill. When I was up and around, my mother bought me a car, my second ATV. She got it from a local fiend who had built it with his own 3 hands. But that's a story for another time.